So yeah, I'm on high-end 3D, and I've got a bunch of favorites. So I've got Facer. If you're doing a search, by the way, I usually go into the free files, go to Maya, go to now you can find other things. There are character rigs. There are what are called paint effects brushes. There are scenes that you can download, and there are shaders. But usually I go to scripts plugins, and I typically want to find stuff that's compatible with 2018. Now, for some reason, it will highlight previous versions, but once you just hit search, you'll see there's over 4,600 files or tools compatible with Maya. So one that we're using this year for rigging purposes is Advanced Skeleton. Okay. Oops. Sorry, give me one sec. So yeah, as I was saying, Advanced Skeleton is great for creating quick character rigs, and we can also set them up so that they're compatible with Motion Builder, and that just allows us to import motion capture files. We actually now have a motion capture studio at the school. $150,000 of motion capture goodness. So you guys can jump in suits and jump around and record that and translate it into animation that can go into your rigs. So there's a lot of tools that I've kind of been scanning through. We used to use AB Auto Rigger as well, but I think that's one we're no longer using. So I've got a bunch of favorites of mine that I've started collecting. I actually just added this one called the wirejumbler. I can show you guys how to install them. There's kind of a basic set of installation that usually works for most scripts. Some tools require some specific steps, and they usually come with instructions somewhere if you're looking on this site. So Facer is one. I'll show you what happens with these scripts. So I downloaded Facer. I'll check my downloads folder. So Facer is right here, right? Generally speaking, it comes with an icon of some sort, and then there's the script. So if you typically go into your Documents folder, Maya, the version number, which is 2018, and then we go to Scripts, you just have to drop this in. You do have to restart Maya, by the way, for this to actually take effect. So you have to close your Maya, relaunch it. So scripts go into the script folder. It's pretty straightforward. Icons go into Preferences, and then Icons. And I've already got Facer in the Icons folder. Now, like I said, I think I made a little mistake when I installed this. So typically speaking, oops, let me go back to my scripts folder. Typically speaking, what you want to do is copy the script name. This is a typical installation, but not necessarily every installation for these scripts. So I'm going to copy just the first part of the name, not the .mel. Mel is Maya's scripting language. And what you want to do is go to your kind of lower right corner in Maya, right? Click on the little script icon, and then you paste in the name of the script and a semicolon. All right, that's the dot with the comma below. And when you hit the play button, this is your kind of execute script button right here. That will launch the script, and you see now it opens up Facer. In this case, it actually auto docks to the side, but you can float it if you want. And if you want to save your script to your shelf up here, so it's a button that you can always click, you simply want to highlight it and say Save Script to Shelf, which I've already done. I've already called it Facer. All right, so now I've got a second one. If I right-click and edit it and go to Shelves, I can update the icon. So it's not just a generic Maya icon. And I'll find the Facer image, save all to Shelves, and you now have that button. You can also right-click and delete it. You can middle mouse click and drag to move a button around if you want, to reorder them if you want. So I think the mistake, by the way, if you try to launch Facer in the labs, I made a typo. So if you right-click and edit the button, I think it's actually got just a sort of a, yeah, the two dots there instead of the semicolon. So you want to make sure it's set to semicolon, and then you can exit that. So if you get an error launching it, that's where the error is coming from. So this, I'm going to show you just a couple of things tying together two different scripts that I like to use. And then I'll show you a third option, which is to get physics simulation. So first we'll just deal with the kind of connecting or using two scripts together. So what I want to do is just make a simple kind of rivet for machine parts, let's say. So I'm going to select the top half, delete the bottom. I should make this a much simpler mesh if I plan to repeat this a lot. But let's just squash this down. And then I will take the edge loop here, hit Control E to extrude. Let's try a thickness. Sometimes, you know, if you look at the angle, if it angles down like this, I don't always like that. And technically right now the extrusion is live or active, so there is technically a second edge loop happening there. But sometimes I just prefer to extrude out. So I will manually just do a regular scaling. And I'll hit Control E again. And again, I think it's a little off axis. I can't quite tell, but if I'm not sure, I can also just move this down. So this is sort of a new bolt that I've got, right? So if you take a look, right, the pivot is sort of in the middle of this thing. And if I want to drop this object onto other objects, I typically want the pivot at the bottom of the object if I'm going to sort of clone it onto the surface of another mesh. So one thing I can do is either hit D and then just slide this thing down. I could center it as well, right? So if but since I left this object in the center of the world, it already had a pivot kind of in the middle of that sphere initially. I don't need to sort of go to modify and center. I can simply just hit D and drop it down. So that might be one consideration if you do have an asymmetrical object. But as I said earlier, I love this little tool. If I go to the Dawson tab that I've set up, go to Facer, I'm just going to simply use the pivot toolbox and say set to base. So I know it's exactly at the bottom of the object. So you could center it first if you were unsure, and then do a base to pivot. So that's step one of centering your object. It did create a locator, by the way, so I'm going to just delete that locator. I may want to also fix the smoothing, so you can see there's kind of a jagged edge here. So what I might just do is go to Mesh Display, Soften Harden Edges. 30 degrees should be okay, I believe, and I'll hit Apply. Let's see what that looks like. So that looks a lot better, right? So that's done. Now let's say we're going to make some sort of I'll just make a really basic box to start. Scale this thing up, move it over. And I've got another tool that I've got, which is called SP Paint 3D. So again, this is also from this site, High-End 3D. So I believe I've already uploaded these to Moodle, so you guys can grab a copy of that. Oops. There we go. So I'll click on this. So this is a script, again, another script you can download and install. A lot of times there are installation instructions. This one was a little bit different than the other one. You do have to go into your Maya 2018 folder. Again, it's a little complicated, but you can figure it out or ask me if you need help. So this script is great. So what it allows you to do is say, I'm going to add my rivet. I'm actually going to scale this thing down, by the way. I should scale it down, and I need to freeze transforms. Let me just freeze transforms on both of these since they were scaled. So this, you basically are creating a mesh that you're brushing with, and then you select the object to brush onto, and now we can hit paint and paint these across. Right? So remember what I said earlier is that, you know, a lot of modeling is just a series of simple techniques that are kind of multiplied, and once you start multiplying and building up a repertoire and a library and a bank of models, you can really start to expand the complexity and look of your scenes, right? Now what's cool about this, let me just undo, you can actually have them randomly rotate. So if I had like a little bolt cut through this, you know, like a screw head, and I wanted each one uniquely rotated, I could have them rotated typically on the y-axis. I can also have them randomly scale. So if you wanted something more organic looking like trees, rocks, things like that, let's set this to 5 times. And now if I paint across, you get variation in size, right? So now you get something that's organic. So what I would usually do is build, like, I have a magic number of about 5. If I want 5 random rocks, I would build 5, uniquely shape them, and then have them randomly rotate, randomly scale, and then brush them in a scene. And you can make thousands, and they all look somewhat unique. And then you can tweak the textures, so each one has a different color, a different, you know. So with a very limited amount of work, you can actually make a massive library and a massive scene very, very quickly. Now, what's great about this is a very kind of boring object, right? So let me just delete that. I'm going to go in and create, let's try a torus. And again, I'll scale this thing up, move it off to the side, and just freeze transforms here. So I'll remove the cube shape here and add the torus, and we can now paint on here as well. So you can paint on unique angles, right? Let me reset the scale randomization. And by the way, I think when you start with this, it's got an offset or a distance threshold, and it might be really, really low, like 1, which means as you paint, you get, right, a ton of them really, really close together. So distance threshold is basically the spacing between. So you can have a greater spacing. You can also go into place mode, which means you're placing one by one. And look at that. As you move, you can click and drag to say, oh, I want that right here. I want this one right here. And how is it doing that? It's, remember what I talked about, normals? It's looking at the normals, or how the polygons are oriented to position that other object. So it's taking its pivot and aligning it to this object's normals. So let me just show you that real quick. Question, yeah?
You know how when you place something, you kind of have to delete what's behind it to like save on polygon?
Yes. So no, usually I would keep, so that's a good question. The question is like, do you have to delete the mesh that's underneath these little rivets or buttons that I've placed? Well, normally not. Usually I would keep the base shape intact, but the stuff that I'm putting on top that you're never going to see behind, I would delete the bottom polys, right? And it's not even necessary to always do that either. You know, usually for video games, usually for like lower budget TV shows, commercials, you need to keep the mesh as light as possible. Even if there's a ton of detail, a lot of times it's like, you know, film sets as well. And when people build film sets, they only build the stuff they're going to shoot. So that's the way we're going to treat virtual worlds. You're only going to build and model the walls and the stuff you're going to see, not the stuff that's behind the camera view, right? Sometimes for lighting purposes, we do have to kind of close off a room, build a wall, or just put a couple of basic objects behind the camera view for lighting, reflection purposes, that sort of thing. But again, like I said, for games, for TV shows and commercials, we often cheat a lot, and you delete stuff that's not visible. But I wouldn't go in and delete like the polygon behind some of these little buttons right on this donut, because, you know, these polygons are actually bigger than any of these buttons, right? So what's also cool about this, let me just delete all of that and make sure my display polygon, I guess that's off for now. I'll take this and remove it. So even if we have like a rocky terrain, I'll just sort of take this and start kind of warping it a bit with soft select. Soft select, there we go. And I'll take this down. This is probably still a pretty small, yeah, pretty small plane. So alright, so we've got some really kind of complex mesh here. Not too complex, I guess, but let me just again freeze transforms, and I'll add this to the paint on. And let's just turn off the grid. I often find that grid distracting, so I usually very quickly turn this thing off. So now we can, right, place this along the surface. Some, you know, maybe aren't catching quite right, in which case you may have to go through and do a little bit of tweaking, but usually it does kind of lock onto the surface fairly well, right? So very, very useful tool, like I said. And I'll show you one last kind of trick that I have for all of this stuff. So let me just make a new scene. And we'll turn our grid back on. So sometimes what I'll do, this is sort of a culmination of things that I've shown you guys over the last week or so. Let me just make this a 2-inch wide brick. I'm going to make a very loose brick wall, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do with this. I'll combine the painting tools, and I'm going to add a physics simulation of this. So, and I'll show you guys another example maybe after the break, depending on how fast I can do this. I'll go to Edit, Duplicate Special, as I've done before. Let me just reset my settings here. So I think this is a 2-inch wide brick, meaning I have to move on X probably 2.5. I'll give it a big gap. Okay, so that works well. Give it 9 copies, apply. And it's only 1 inch high, so I probably need to move like 1.5 inches up and make one copy. And I'll move this off 1.25, which is half the distance, right? So if I want to get this kind of stacking brick effect, I'll do that. And then I need to move it up, let's say 3 units, I think. Let me try that. There we go, that works. I'll do that maybe like 6 times. Now, if you have a brick wall, let's say you wanted it, you know, you're going to put just a plane behind it and rough up the plane to make it look like the grout in between. I've got another tool that I use for this, which is called, I call it Rando, but it's actually FX Transform Randomizer. So this is another script I've downloaded from here, FX Transform Randomizer. And what it allows you to do is randomize the kind of orientation and rotation. So if I go into Randomize and I do a slight rotation of, let's say, 5 degrees, and I could do it on all axes, or I can pick just X, just Y, or just Z. Let me just scale this out so we can see all the options here. Right? I can get them to all look more organic, because nothing in reality is perfect. Even things that come out of the factory have little flaws and imperfections, and over time things get damaged, they get pushed out of shape. I can do a random translate on Z. So if I grab these and randomly push them in and out on Z, well, that's a lot, right? So Z being the forwards, backwards axis. So let's say I just do a very slight amount of 1. Okay, maybe let's do less than that, because these bricks are 1 inch deep, so we'll do 0.2. Right? Now they have varying depths. And some brick walls purposely do this, where they have some that are further in, some that are further out. And you can go really crazy with this, right? So I can say, let's randomize by 90 degrees plus or minus on X, Y, and Z. Right? So you can make chaos very easily that way. I can also randomize the translation, so I can push these all off about 20 units. X, Y, Z. Now, I may not want to do that. I'll just try it maybe on Z. So what I'm looking for is no brick to be touching. And I'll show you why that's important, because I'm going to do a physics simulation. When you do a physics simulation, you need the objects to not be actually touching to start. So let's do random rotate. So again, everything's a little bit chaotic, right? I'll take this whole group, go to rotate. By the way, sometimes when you rotate by default, if I double click on the rotate tool, it may be set to default, which means each object will rotate around its center at the same time. That can be very useful, but in this case I want to grab the selection as if it were a group and rotate the whole group. So let's do that. I'll move the whole group up, and I generally speaking want them to kind of fall straight down. So I'll take this group. And what I'm going to do next is switch my menu from modeling to FX. So under Effects, I'll go to Fields and Solvers, and I'm going to go down to Active Rigid Body. So what this is going to do, by the way, before I do this, I forgot one step. I should take these. Since they're all rotated, they have all this XYZ translation rotation applied to them. I want to actually freeze them for the simulation to be correct. The simulation needs to look at the objects where they are and what state they're in, and not their initial state, because what it might do is kind of throw this whole thing off. So I need to freeze the transforms first. Modify freeze, Fields and Solvers, and I'll go to Active Rigid Body. So I'll go Active Rigid Body, and I'll reset this so we can see the original settings here. So I made these a little bit heavier because I want them to kind of pile up on each other very, very quickly. And there's also a friction. There's a bounciness as well. So if you have a high bounciness, it could be like rubber. If you have a low bounciness, it'll be like concrete, cement, that sort of stuff, right? So I can lower the bounciness to maybe like 0.2, so there's a little bit of bounce, so they can kind of jumble around a bit. Friction I usually max out when I want them to stay clustered together. And then I hit Create. So they're going to get a bunch of these little kind of locator things. Next up, I'm going to create a plane and scale this up pretty large. Remember, freeze transforms. With the plane selected, so that means that it'll apply these settings to that object. I'll do the same thing. I'll go to the settings for passive rigid body, not active. So passive, let me bring that up one more time. So passive rigid body basically means that it'll be in the scene, it'll be interacting with the objects, but it won't drop through the home grid or the 0 of the y-axis. So it'll interact with stuff, and it's actually going to take on the settings that I had for the active rigid body. And in this case, I'm okay with it. If you wanted a bouncier floor, a less friction-based floor, then you can reset that if you wanted to. But in this case, I'm okay with that. So I'll hit create. Last step, you want to grab everything, go to fields and solvers, and you want to create gravity. We create gravity. Next step, I'm going to just hit, usually the simulation can take a little bit of time, so I'll set it to 2000 frames, and then I'll just extend my timeline out. And if we hit the play button over here, we get a simulation. So, nice. So, you know, sometimes you can make piles of broken wood, piles of brick. You know, if you have, usually the apocalypse is a very popular scenario for 3D, especially in big budget movies, right? Everything's a disaster, everything's crazy and all over the place. So I'll hit stop right now. My final step to kind of make this a permanent kind of mesh, you see all these little kind of X's? These are sort of the simulation, the rigid body simulation tools that are kind of used to help this thing calculate out. What I want to do is grab all the mesh. By the way, we can sort of categorize the mesh selection here. So I can, if I expand this little option here, you can make none of the objects selectable, and then switch to just regular mesh. Oops. Sorry, this one here. That's the icon. Okay. So if I go into Edit, Delete by Type, for some reason delete by history doesn't work. You have to go Edit, Delete by Type, Rigid Bodies. And that'll clear this out of the scene. There's no longer any animation. Oh, except for that one brick I missed. So I'll delete that. I'll delete my ground plane for now. And any other solvers in here, usually I like to clean out. So I'll try to grab the gravity. Let's switch our all objects back on so I can actually grab the solver again. And I'll sort of just focus on the bricks that are closer together. Okay. So I'll just delete the outer periphery ones here. Excuse me. I'll take these, shift right click, combine. So it's one mass object. I'll go back to Dawson, Facer. And I'll go back to my pivot toolbox. I'm going to just center pivot, base to pivot. All right. Now I can go back to the paint script. Hopefully you guys see where I'm going with this, right? So I'm going to freeze the transforms on this thing. Let's just make sure. What am I selecting? There we go. Add that. I should rename this stuff, by the way. I'm just going really quick for demo purposes, but now I can paint. So I'm going to randomly rotate on the y-axis, right? Because that's going to turn it. I don't want it to flip on its side, but I want it to kind of spin from a top view, right? So I can have random rotation. So from 0 to 360. And maybe I'll vary the scale 0.75 to 1.5. So we get variation. So we get small bricks, big bricks. Right? Welcome to the apocalypse. And by the way, the spacing is actually really low, so maybe I want to increase that a little bit so each pile has its own, right? So this is what I was saying about like simple steps, adding one on top of the next, right? I took simple bricks, made a simple pattern, did some quick rotations and offsets, then I did a quick physics simulation, combined them. Yes, there's a question. They might, but are you going to notice? Probably not. So they may clip or they may interact with each other. So if you want to avoid that, just adjust your spacing. Or you can go to place, right? So I can place this pile, place, you know? So there's all sorts of ways you can do it. I mean, yeah, you can if you need to. Absolutely. Sometimes what I'll do as well, like if you want to create a garbage pile or something, like a real heaping pile, when you make your plane, like this, for example, just take your vertex. Oops, sorry, let me get into object mode. I'm going to isolate this. Go to vertex, and let me go to the modeling toolkit for a second. Set this to 30, right? So you can make a pile. So you'd have a fake kind of pile underneath, and then you do a simulation on top of that. Yeah. All the time, yeah, but I will warn you guys, if you want to do any physics simulation, especially like cloth on characters and stuff, it gets really heavy, really slow. It can be really difficult. So you want to plan your character models and your environments to not need that. But there is actually even a whole career now, which is called, I forget what it's called actually. But yeah, there's basically a category where people just do cloth simulation, stuff like this, like destruction, yeah, physics simulation. But for student films, because that stuff is so technical and it can get so buggy, you don't want to make that a key part of your film or project that will rely on that. For me, I do it for quick stuff, and then I don't need to animate it after. But you can record the animation if you want and render it out. Yeah. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to make a bunch of copies of these things. I'm going to also just quickly freeze transforms. So take this object, do a duplicate special. Duplicate special. Just reset the settings from last time. I won't do an instance just because I want to change each one a little bit. Let's move each one off about 5 units, and I'll make, I guess, about 15, 16 books. Alright, I'll get them a little closer though. Let's do 2 units. Let's do 3.5. Okay, so like I said before, now I could, have different styles and shapes of these as well, but just for the simplicity of demonstration, I'm going to kind of leave them this way. But to make them look different, I will go to the random transform randomizer and randomize their scale. So let's try this. Random XYZ, right? It's pretty good. So next I can try to go, maybe I'll go back actually to the randomizer and randomize rotation, not a ton, but maybe like 5 or 10 degrees, and I'll try it on, yeah, XYZ, and I might just hit it 1 or 2 more times just to get a little more random. And then I can build a little bookshelf. So similar to the example earlier, so I'll just make this thing wide enough for now, so that they land. Let's view this from a top view. That seems pretty good. Okay, so I'll move this thing up. And remember, we got to freeze all this stuff. So I'm just going to grab everything, go modify, freeze transforms. And then I will select the bookshelf itself and go to passive rigid body. I always go to the settings. I'm going to turn bounciness down to basically 0, hit create, then select the books and do the same thing. Well, except for I'll select them as active, not passive. Okay, so I'll hit create, and then generally speaking I usually select all the objects when I create the gravity to make sure that everything's affected by the same gravity solver. You can also adjust the gravity here. You can make it stronger, weaker. You can change the direction it operates in, but generally speaking, it's best to leave that. Yeah.
Can you change like the weight of objects so the gravity affects them?
Yeah, you can make the gravity heavier, lighter.
Or all of them the same amount?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure about the settings. Like if I go to help and maybe help on gravity, I think it'll sort of tell you what the numbers mean. So magnitude, right? The greater the magnitude, the faster the objects will accelerate, and the greater the gravitational force. I don't know what scale that's on though. If that 9.8 is like 9.8 newtons or what that, I've used other software where 1 is Earth gravity, 0.3 I think, or 0.2 is like moon gravity. So you can kind of play with that, but I think generally speaking, the default is comparable to real gravity. Okay. So yeah, I'll just set my thing to 2,000 frames, and again extend this out. Oops, sorry. Set that there. Make sure you're at frame 0, and then we can hit play. And nothing happens. I think I forgot to actually create my gravity. I must have hit an undo. So we'll go to gravity. There we go. Boom. So there they go, right? So now you've got, right, an organic looking, feeling bookshelf without having to hand rotate every piece. So again, I just wanted to show you guys that, like, the ability to kind of mass produce, mass edit stuff and do it fairly efficiently. Yeah.
You just wanted to have the books sitting flat together, or you just scale it?
Well, yeah, so the question is if you just want them like straight up and down, flat, like packed together.
Once you made the different sizes, it was randomly.
Sorry, let me just make sure the simulation, yeah, the simulation stopped. Just to remind you guys, before I go back to that question, you want to go edit, edit, delete by type, rigid bodies, delete your gravity solver, and then, you know, this will stay fixed in the scene basically, right? So these are the new orientations. If you want them kind of sitting from the bottom, so let me just undo a bunch here before all this. Let's undo before the random rotations. So before I duplicate, remember what I do, I'm using Facer, right? The Facer toolbox here. I'd go to the pivot toolbox, set base to pivot. And now, remember, because the pivot is at the bottom, right? A lot of times we want contact with the ground with another object. Solid contact often means that the pivot needs to be at the bottom. Or you can have a bone, but again, essentially you're trying to get the pivot to the bottom of the object. So for that, well, now if I go random scale, right? Random scale, they scale from the bottom, right? So that's the point of having the base to pivot, or pivot to base, I should say, is that, you know, some really weird books now, but yeah, so you can also, like with the random XYZ, you can kind of just randomize, maybe not the Y, but you can say, oh, maybe I want the thickness and depth to vary. So I'm just going to do X only, then Z only, right? So you get variations on that. We can also go like lower. So 1 is 100% scale, 0.5 is like half, up to half scale variation. Okay, so I think that's enough